Violence is so deeply woven into the fabric of our society that most of us don't even recognize it anymore. But what's truly shocking is how early it begins. Research shows that fetuses can actually absorb violent energy patterns before they even take their first breath.
That's such a fascinating perspective on violence. And you know what really caught my attention about this research? The way it challenges our basic understanding of how behavioral patterns develop.
Well, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Bruce Lipton's work shows that these patterns start forming literally at conception. We're talking about emotional imprints being encoded into DNA.
The implications of that are honestly staggering. How does that early programming affect someone's entire life trajectory?
It's like this domino effect. A child born into a violent environment isn't just dealing with what they absorbed in the womb, they're then surrounded by violence in multiple forms: TV shows, aggressive discipline, neighborhood conflicts.
That reminds me of something really interesting from the research: how violence can manifest in completely unexpected ways. Like the case study of a woman who developed an ultra sweet, compliant personality as a response to growing up in an extremely violent household.
Right? And that's what makes this so complex. We tend to think of violence as just physical aggression, but there are actually 7 distinct types of violence that can shape our lives.
Could you break those down? I think understanding these different forms might help people recognize patterns in their own lives.
Well, first you've got the obvious physical violence, but then there's emotional violence, like withholding love as punishment. Then psychological violence through lying and manipulation, verbal violence in how we speak to ourselves and others, spiritual violence through religious control, economic violence using money as power, and even educational violence through conditioning.
That last one, educational violence, that's particularly eye-opening. The idea that the very system meant to empower people could be used to create dependency.
And here's what's really fascinating about all this. These patterns of violence tend to attract similar energies. So people who grew up in violent households often end up in relationships with partners who have similar backgrounds, even if they're playing different roles in the dynamic.
That makes me think about how breaking these cycles must require an enormous amount of self-awareness and intentional work.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is how this deprogramming process has to start with our relationship with ourselves. Even things we might consider normal, like being a workaholic or having poor dietary habits, are actually forms of self-directed violence.
So what you're saying is that the path to reducing violence in society actually begins with how we treat ourselves.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Research shows that when we start addressing our own violent tendencies, it creates this ripple effect. We become less likely to attract or accept violent behavior from others, which then influences our communities.
That's such a powerful perspective, the idea that personal transformation could actually lead to broader societal change.
Well, think about it this way. If violence is learned and programmed from such an early age, it stands to reason that peace and nonviolence can be learned too. It's just that we have to be incredibly intentional about it.
The challenging part must be maintaining that intention while dealing with all the subtle forms of violence we encounter daily.
You know what's really crucial about this process? It's not about becoming some perfectly Zen being who never experiences negative emotions. It's about learning to handle those emotions in nonviolent ways.
That reminds me of something from the research: how the woman learned to experience anger without throwing tantrums or blaming others. It was like she had to completely rewrite her emotional programming.
And that's exactly why this work is so challenging, but also so important. We're not just trying to change surface behaviors. We're actually rewiring patterns that were encoded before we were even born.
The implications for parenting and education are pretty profound when you think about it.
Well, here's what really gets me thinking. If we could apply this understanding on a broader scale, imagine how it might change our approach to everything from early childhood education to conflict resolution.
That's such an important point about systemic change. How do you think we start making those broader shifts?
I think it starts with understanding that this isn't just about stopping obvious forms of violence. It's about creating environments that actively promote peace and emotional intelligence from the earliest possible moment.
The research suggests that even small changes in how we handle our own emotions can have significant ripple effects.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating is how this connects to modern neuroscience. We're discovering that the brain actually has remarkable plasticity, meaning these patterns of violence, even when deeply ingrained, can be rewired.
That's really hopeful, isn't it? The idea that no matter how deeply programmed these patterns might be, change is possible.
Well, what's even more interesting is how this individual work connects to larger social movements. When enough people start doing this internal work, it creates a kind of collective shift in consciousness.
That makes me think about historical movements for social change, how they often started with individual transformations that eventually reached critical mass.
And here's something really powerful to consider. Every major social transformation in history started with individuals making different choices. Whether it was Gandhi's nonviolent resistance or Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful protests, it all began with personal commitment to breaking cycles of violence.
So, in essence, like what we're talking about is both deeply personal and profoundly social at the same time.
That's right. And what's really fascinating is how this understanding is being validated by multiple fields of study, from epigenetics to social psychology to neuroscience. They're all pointing to the same conclusion, that patterns of violence can be transformed, but it requires conscious effort and understanding.
You know what strikes me as particularly important? The emphasis on doing this work without violence toward ourselves in the process.
Absolutely right. It's like this delicate balance. We need to be firm in our commitment to change while being gentle with ourselves as we learn and grow. It's not about perfect execution. It's about consistent progress.
That's such a crucial distinction for anyone embarking on this kind of transformation.
And here's what I find most encouraging about all of this. Every small step we take toward reducing violence in our own lives contributes to a larger shift in our collective consciousness. It's like dropping a pebble in a pond. The ripples keep expanding outward.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. It makes the work feel both manageable and meaningful.
Well, as we wrap up, I think the key takeaway is that transforming violence isn't just about stopping negative behaviors. It's about actively cultivating peace, starting with ourselves and radiating outward to touch every aspect of our lives and communities.
And remembering that this work, while challenging, has the potential to create lasting change, not just